3 words kept looping through the chamber, and no one moved. "Do not return." The voice was flat, human. It repeated itself every few seconds, echoing off 9,000 years of black stone, and still no one in the spire of verdict reached to shut it off. High Chancellor Vorthan Sorvath sat on the obsidian throne with his claws pressed so hard into the armrest that fresh grooves had opened in the stone. Fresh. Not the old ceremonial wear of 2 centuries on the throne, cut within the last hour. Around him, 3,000 delegates sat in a silence so complete that the air recyclers sounded like a scream. 72 hours ago, this same chamber had voted to erase the human species from a single line on a star chart. 8,000 years of unbroken expansion had taught the Voranthi Empire exactly one lesson. Nothing ever told them no. Not planets, not fleets, not ink on 300-year-old paper that nobody had bothered to read. Now the chamber was listening to what nothing sounded like. Elder Thessary sat in the observer's ring, hands folded in her lap, and did not look away from the throne. She had watched empires rise for 400 years. She had never once watched one learn to read. The recording looped again. "Do not return." No fleet count behind it. No threat, no gloating, no second sentence. Just the 3 words, and under them, so faint it might have been imagined, the sound of something very large going quiet. Nobody in the spire knew yet how many ships had crossed the Kareth Nebula that morning, or how many had not come back through it. That number sat somewhere on a data slate no one had dared to open. The vote that had started all of this, 3,872 in favor, 18 against, was still glowing on the chamber's central display, as if the number itself hadn't understood yet that it was already wrong. The recording did not stop, and neither will this. Stay close, the silence is about to explain itself. 72 hours before any of this had a name. Elder Thessary was doing the same thing she had done every session for 4 centuries, counting hands before they were raised, because the count always told her more than the debate did. The spire of verdict smelled the way it always smelled, old iron, and under it, the faint chemical bite of air scrubbers working too hard for too many lungs. 9,200 years of obsidian rose past the delegates and disappeared into a ceiling no light reached. It was a room built to make anyone standing in it feel very small and very temporary, and it had been doing its job since before most of the species inside it existed. The agenda item was administrative, Sector 42 Gamma, Third World, minor annexation. Sub-Chancellor Vex read it the way he read every conquest brief, bored, certain, already 3 sentences into the next one in his head. 6 campaigns, 2 pacifications, and not one moment of doubt in either. "Terra," he said, tasting the word like it might be a joke. "No standing fleet. No colonies of note. Population negligible. They have been quiet for 300 years. Councillor Thessa, young enough to still enjoy the sound of her own vote, tapped her approval before the reading even finished. Scribe Kell logged it without looking up. That was the normal shape of these mornings. Quiet species got erased from star charts the way old furniture got moved out of a room without anyone asking whether it had been useful. Thessary raised a hand. "There's a treaty on file." Vex didn't look up from his slate. "There are treaties on file for 900 systems, Elder. Most of them are ceremony. This one is not." She had read it. She was fairly sure she was the only person in the chamber who had. Near the back of the human delegation's small annex, 3 seats, rarely filled, mostly forgotten, Ambassador Draven Sorvath sat with a folio across his knees. Brown leather, the spine cracked soft from 300 years of folding and unfolding by ambassadors who had come before him. He opened it now, carefully, the way you open something that has outlived everyone who signed it. The leather was warm from the journey. The ink inside was not. It had been cold for 3 centuries, waiting for someone to need it. He had been told, long before this posting, to keep the law close. He had not understood until this morning how close it would need to be. Section 12, Annex 4, Clause 2. He read it silently, one more time, though he already knew every word. Should any outside force attempt to claim or occupy Terran territory, that force is hereby forbidden from entering the territory of Terran, and the human species reserves the right to enforce this prohibition by any means necessary. Nobody in the spire had asked him to read it aloud, yet. Far from the chamber, on a station called Vigil that orbited nothing anyone in the Voranthi Empire had ever bothered to name, Admiral Cora Ishani watched the same broadcast on a screen the size of her hand. 56 years old, gray at the edges, a face that did not move when it thought. She held a cup of tea that had gone cold 2 hours earlier and had not noticed because she was not really drinking it, she was just holding it. She had been holding some version of it for 30 years. "They're voting," said Lieutenant Commander Hara, 11 years in intelligence, still young enough to sound surprised by things Ishani had stopped being surprised by a decade ago. "It's not even close. It won't be," Ishani said. "They've never had to make it close before. No warning to the humans. No formal notice. No chance to answer before the count went up on a wall 9,000 light-years from the world it was deciding. The vote closed. 3,872 in favor, 18 against. Thessaly was one of the 18. So was the human annex, though its 3 votes barely registered against a number that large, the kind of number that erases the smaller ones just by existing next to them. High Chancellor Vorthan Sorveth rose from the obsidian throne to speak, and the chamber went quiet in the way it always went quiet for him, not from fear exactly, but from 800 years of never once being interrupted. "The Varanthe Empire claims these systems," he said, in a voice that had announced 47 conquests before this one and expected this to feel exactly the same. "Terran territory is annexed, effective immediately. Compliance is expected within 5 standard days." He did not ask if anyone objected. Nobody ever did. Ambassador Draven Sorveth stood, folio still open in his hand, and requested the floor. The Chancellor's gaze slid to him the way it slid to anything small and beneath consideration. "The priority 4 delegation," he said. "Not quite a question, not quite an insult, somewhere comfortably between. You have 30 seconds. I only need 1, Draven said. "There is a treaty. The Valdari Empire, your predecessor state, signed it 300 years ago. It has never been repealed. It has never even been read by anyone currently sitting in this chamber." A ripple of something moved through the delegates, not concern. Curiosity, the way a crowd gets curious right before it starts laughing. Vorthan's claws did not move yet from the armrest. That would come later. For now they stayed still, patient, the patience of something that had never once needed to be afraid of a piece of paper. "Read it then," he said, "since you clearly came prepared to." Draven looked down at the folio. The ink had waited 300 years for this exact sentence to be spoken aloud, and it did not care that almost no one in the room understood yet what they were about to hear. "Section 12, he said. "Annex 4, Clause 2. His voice did not shake. "Should any outside force attempt to claim or occupy Terran territory, that force is hereby forbidden from entering the territory of Terran, and the human species reserves the right to enforce this prohibition by any means necessary." Silence. Then, from somewhere near the throne, a single soft sound that might have been a laugh trying to decide if it was allowed to happen. "That," said High Chancellor Vorthan Sorveth, "is meaningless. I have never heard of this document in my life." "You chose not to read it," Draven said. "That is not the same thing as it not existing." Elder Thessaly watched the Chancellor's claws finally move, one slow drag against the armrest, the first mark of what would in 72 hours be a set of fresh grooves cut into 9,000 years of stone. No fear in it yet. Just the faint, distant itch of something ancient discovering it did not like a new sound. No treaty had ever stopped them. No delegation had ever finished a sentence like that one. No one in the chamber had ever watched Vorthan Sorveth go still the way he went still now. Not with worry, not yet, just with the particular quiet of a man recalculating something he had never expected to need to recalculate. Vorthan Sorveth did not sit back down. Instead, he descended 2 steps from the throne, something he had not done in a session in over a decade, and crossed to where Ambassador Draven Sorveth still stood with the folio open in his hands. "You misunderstand your position," the Chancellor said, quiet enough that only the front rows caught it clearly. "A treaty is a courtesy extended between equals. Your species was never our equal. It was merely unbothered. The document doesn't ask whether we're equals," Draven said. "It only asks whether you occupy our territory. You've already announced that you intend to. Then I withdraw nothing." Vorthan's voice climbed, filling the chamber the way it always did, the way it had filled 47 other chambers on 47 other worlds before this one. "The first expeditionary fleet departs within the hour. 1,200 ships. You may read your ink to them as they land." Sub-Chancellor Vex rose beside him, scales catching the low chamber light, certain in the way men are certain right before certainty becomes a liability. "There is no defense on record for that system. No standing fleet. This will not require a battle. It will require a landing party. Elder Thessery did not stand. She had learned 4 centuries ago that the moment to be loud was rarely the moment everyone else was already shouting. Instead, she watched Ambassador Draven close the folio, slowly, and understood that he was not finished. He was simply done arguing with people who had already decided not to listen. The treaty requires one more thing, Draven said, and his voice had gone very level. The way water goes level right before it's about to move. A written acknowledgement of the prohibition, filed with this conclave, within a reasonable interval of the declaration being read. Failure to file triggers automatic escalation under Clause 4. You have declined to acknowledge it. That is now on record. Escalation, Vorthen repeated, and this time something in the word amused him. Escalation to what, Ambassador? You have no fleet. Draven didn't answer. He simply sat back down, folio closed on his lap, and let the silence do what his voice no longer needed to. In the back row of the observers' gallery, a young woman with dark, unreadable eyes had not spoken once through the entire session. Veska Sorveth, the Chancellor's youngest daughter, 87 years old, and rarely permitted a vote of her own, watched her father return to the throne with his claws already cutting new lines into the stone. She had watched him win 47 times. This was the first time she had ever seen him look for reassurance and not find any in the room. Vigil Station did not have a throne, or 9,000 years of obsidian, or 3,000 delegates. It had a command deck the size of a modest house, gray composite walls, and Admiral Cora Ishani standing over a tactical display with her cold tea, finally set down and forgotten for good. Confirmed, Hara said, reading off the feed with the particular flatness people use when they don't want their voice to show what they're feeling. 1,200 hulls, Imperial signature. Departure window inside the hour. It's the only approach that doesn't require them to fly through a star. They've used it for as long as there's been an empire to use it. And we've been watching it for years. Ishani did not smile, exactly, but something in her face loosened by a fraction. Entry vector projects through the Kareth Nebula matches every previous incursion pattern in the archive. It would, Ishani said. The particular ease of a person finally being allowed to do the thing they had spent 3 decades preparing to do. Wake the grid. Hara's hands moved across the console, and for a moment nothing on Vigil Station looked any different at all. No lights changed, no alarms sounded. Nothing that would have told an outside observer that anything of consequence had just happened. That was, Ishani thought, rather the point. 30 years of quiet had been the whole design. The Terran defense grid had not been announced, requisitioned, or debated in any chamber that answered to anyone outside the Sol system. It had been built the way careful people build anything meant to survive contact with someone who isn't paying attention. One platform at a time, one budget line at a time. Funded under headings dull enough that nobody with an empire to run ever thought to ask what they meant. 42 capital ships, enough automated platforms strung across the Kareth approach to make the empty space between worlds into something considerably less empty than it looked on any chart the Voranthi had ever drawn. They're not going to see it, Hara said. It wasn't quite a question, no. Ishani agreed. They've never had to look before, that's not a flaw in their sensors. It's a flaw in 300 years of never being wrong. She keyed the comm to a channel that wouldn't be answered for hours yet, and recorded 3 words she had been carrying, unspoken, since long before this morning's vote. She did not send them, not yet. She simply wanted them ready. 1,700 kilometers away, in the Inkwell, the small diplomatic annex the Empire had allotted the human delegation, more storage closet than office, Ambassador Draven Sorvath sat alone with the folio open on the desk in front of him. He was not reading it. He knew every clause by memory now, the way you know a scar. He was only looking at the ink and thinking that in 300 years, no one on either side of this treaty had ever expected it to be tested. A knock. Veska Sorveth, alone, without an escort, which was itself unusual enough that Draven stood before she'd finished stepping through the doorway. "My father believes you're bluffing," she said. No greeting. Her voice was quieter than the throne room had allowed her to use. "I don't." "Why not?" "Because you didn't raise your voice once." She glanced at the folio, still open, ink catching the annex's dim light. "Everyone who has ever lied to my father has raised their voice. You didn't need to." Draven said nothing. Veska left as quietly as she'd arrived, and Draven closed the folio once more, and did not yet know that 72 hours from this exact moment, he would be opening it again in front of the entire conclave. There was nothing in that observation that required an answer, and he had learned, across a career spent mostly being ignored, that silence was frequently the strongest reply available to him. In a chamber gone so silent it would remember the sound of nothing for the rest of its 9,000-year existence. The first expeditionary fleet crossed into the Karath Nebula 70 hours later, exactly on schedule, exactly along the route it had used for longer than most of its crews had been alive. Admiral Vex stood on the flagship's bridge and watched the sensor returns come back clean. No contacts, no fortifications, nothing at all where the charts had always shown nothing. "Territory of Terran," he said to no one in particular, tasting the phrase the way he'd tasted it in the chamber, still faintly amused by it. "Let's see what they think they're going to enforce it with." Behind him, unlogged on any Imperial chart, 42 ships that had been sitting dark and silent for 3 decades finished their final systems check and waited. Admiral Vex never got to finish tasting his own amusement. The grid did not announce itself. It didn't need to. One moment the sensor returns were clean, and the next, space along the Karath approach simply stopped being empty, not with light, not with warning, but with the particular silence of something that had been waiting so long it no longer needed to hurry. Vex's demand for surrender went out on every open channel his fleet carried. He gave the human system a handful of minutes to comply, the way he'd given 47 other worlds a handful of minutes before this one. Certain the silence that answered him was fear. It wasn't. It was the sound of mines already armed and platforms already tracking, waiting for the fleet to finish drifting deeper into range before anyone bothered to fire a shot that might warn the ships behind it. Elder Thessary was not on Vigil Station and never would be. She sat in the spire of Verdict, in the same seat she had occupied for 400 years, watching a secondary feed the Conclave's War Office had patched through out of habit rather than expectation. She did not gasp when the first Terran platforms opened fire. She had spent her whole long life reading documents no one else bothered to read, and she recognized in the shape of what she was watching the particular silence of a species that had been planning this for longer than anyone in the chamber had thought to ask. "They're not falling back," said someone near her, Counselor Thessa, the same young voice that had voted yes without hesitation 72 hours earlier, now leaning forward with her hands pressed flat against the rail. "Why aren't they falling back?" "Because their sensors never saw the mines," Thessary said quietly enough that only Thessa heard it. "You cannot retreat from a wall you don't know is there." On Vigil Station, Ishani did not raise her voice either. She stood over the tactical display with both hands resting flat on its edge, watching red contacts fold into wreckage one section at a time, and said almost nothing at all beyond the occasional flat confirmation to Hera. This was not a battle she needed to win with noise. The nebula doesn't care which direction they're pointed. What the Voranthi fleet did not understand could not understand. It had been won in the quiet parts of budget lines and unread treaty clauses, years before the first shot. Flagships losing power across half its systems, Hera reported, voice tight but steady. "They're trying to reverse the vector." "Let them try," Ishani said. Not with sensors calibrated for 300 years to find nothing along this route, was that the platforms surrounding them had never needed to be seen to work. They only needed to be there, patient, in numbers large enough that a fleet built to conquer worlds had no framework at all for a fight it couldn't locate. A pre-twist quiet moved through the inkwell, 1,700 kilometers from the throne room where none of this yet had a name spoken aloud. Ambassador Draven Sorvath sat with the folio closed in front of him, both hands flat on its cracked spine, and did nothing more dramatic than straighten a stack of unrelated correspondence he had no real reason to straighten. He had done everything the treaty required of him. There was nothing left to do now but wait, the way his predecessors had waited for 300 years, in a room too small to hold what was about to change because of it. The engagement did not last long enough for the Conclave's War Office to draft a single coherent report before it was already over. What reached the spire first was not numbers. Thessary noted, with something close to relief, that no one seemed able to produce an exact count of losses, only the word severe, repeated by increasingly pale-faced officers who had never had to say it about anything before. The fleet that had crossed into Terran space with total confidence was within the span of one uninterrupted transmission, no longer a fleet in any sense the chamber recognized. It was scattered debris and a handful of ships limping back through the nebula they'd entered so easily. High Chancellor Vorthan Sorvath stood from the obsidian throne without being asked to, which itself was an event no one in the chamber had a precedent for. His claws, which had spent 72 hours cutting slow grooves into the armrest one small mark at a time, went suddenly, completely still. It was then, in the gap between the War Office's silence and the Chancellor's, that Veska Sorvath spoke for the first time in the entire session. "Father." Her voice did not carry the way a trained speaker's would have. She had never been trained to speak in this chamber, only to sit in it, but it was clear enough that the front rows turned. They told us, before any of this happened. They wrote it down and handed it to us, and we called it meaningless because it was inconvenient to read. Vorthen did not answer her. He was looking at the War Office's feed, at wreckage that had a shape now, spreading slowly across a display that had never before in the Spire's existence been asked to show a Voranthi defeat. Elder Thessary watched the Chancellor's face and understood, in that moment, that the strongest thing that had happened in this entire 72-hour span was not the battle at all. It was this, the exact second an 800-year certainty ran out of anywhere left to stand. The transmission came through on every channel the Conclave's War Office monitored, unencrypted, unhurried, 3 words recorded by a voice that had not raised itself once through the entire exchange. "Do not return." It did not repeat immediately. It played once, cleanly, and then the channel went silent. No gloating follow-up, no list of demands, nothing that gave the chamber anywhere to direct its anger. Just the sentence, sitting in the recycled air of a 9,000-year-old room, refusing to be anything other than exactly what it was. Thessary realized, watching the Chancellor sink back onto the throne he had not asked permission to leave, that this was not the end of the story the chamber had gathered to hear. It was only the moment the chamber finally understood which story it had actually been living in for 300 years, and that the next one, the one still to come, would be about what an empire does with itself once it has run out of certainty to stand on. No one in the spire spoke for a long moment. Then Elder Thessary rose from the observer's ring, slowly. The way old things rise when they've been sitting still long enough to feel it. She did not address the throne. She addressed the chamber. 400 years I have sat in this ring, she said. I have watched this body vote to erase quiet species from star charts more times than I can count anymore. Not once have I seen anyone ask what a quiet species does with the time it isn't spending shouting. No one answered her. No one needed to. The War Office's feed still hung above the chamber floor, wreckage drifting where a fleet had been, and under it, nothing. Veska Sorvath crossed the small distance to the throne and did the thing she had never once been permitted to do in this chamber. She reached out and placed her hand on her father's arm. No second wave, no demand, no gloating follow-up transmission arriving to twist the wound deeper, just the silence the Terrans had apparently decided was answer enough. In front of 3,000 delegates who had spent his entire reign watching him need nothing from anyone. They did not warn us, she said, quiet enough now that only those nearest the throne caught it. They simply told us we were forbidden, in writing, and let us decide for ourselves whether we believed them. We didn't. We walked in anyway. High Chancellor Vorthen Sorvath did not answer his daughter. His claws, still and silent now against the armrest, no longer had anything left to cut into the stone. 847 years of never once being wrong had ended not with a fleet destroyed, though that was part of it, but with a piece of paper he had chosen not to read, and a daughter who had. Ambassador Draven Sorvath received word of it in the inkwell, alone, the way he had received most of his career's more significant moments. The message came through a junior clerk who did not fully understand what she was delivering, only that the Chancellor's office had requested, not summoned, requested his presence back in the spire. He gathered the folio from the desk before he left. Out of habit more than need, he no longer required it to make his case. The case had already made itself in a language the Empire finally understood, spoken not by him but by 42 ships that had sat dark and patient for years so that they would never have to speak at all. The spire of verdict, when he returned, did not sound like the room he had left 3 days earlier. There was no debate, no vote pending. Just 3,000 delegates sitting in a silence that had nothing left to argue with, and a throne occupied by a man who for the first time in Elder Thessary's 4 centuries of watching him, looked his age. Ambassador, Vorthen said, and something in his voice had gone unfamiliar, not broken, not humbled exactly, but recalibrated. the way a compass needle settles after being wrenched too hard in the wrong direction. The Empire acknowledges the treaty. 3 words. It was not an apology. Draven had not expected one and did not need it. Acknowledged, he said, and filed. He set the folio down on the small table before the throne, open to the clause that had started all of it, ink still legible after 300 years of being ignored. That's all the treaty ever asked for. Vorthen looked down at the page for a long moment, the first time Thessary realized, watching from the ring, that he had ever actually looked at it rather than past it. We measured strength in ships taken, he said, more to himself than to the room. You measured it in words never broken. Draven didn't answer that either. There was nothing in it that required correction. 3 months later, the reports reaching the Spire noted something the War Office's analysts struggled to phrase in a briefing that didn't sound absurd. The Empire had not launched a new annexation campaign since the Karath engagement. Not one. 8,000 years of unbroken expansion had simply stopped, the way a long habit stops once the person holding it finally notices their own hand shaking. No formal decree announced it. No treaty was signed to make it official. It was only delegates began to notice that proposals for new campaigns stopped reaching the floor for a vote at all, quietly redirected by clerks and sub-chancellors who had learned, in the space of one afternoon, that not every silence belonged to the weak. Elder Thessary kept her seat in the observer's ring. She had outlasted worse surprises than this one, though she privately admitted, to no one, that she had never expected to outlast an empire's certainty in the span of a single season. In the inkwell, Ambassador Draven Sorvath sat once more with the folio open across his knees, the way his predecessors had sat with it for 300 years before this moment finally arrived to justify all that waiting. He read the clause one final time, not because he needed to. He could recite it now the way some men recite a prayer, but because it seemed correct to give it that after everything it had done. Then he closed it. The leather was cold now, not from the journey this time, but from the room, and from 300 years finally settling into something that no longer needed carrying so carefully. The ink inside had waited a long time to be read. It would not need to wait again. He set the folio on the shelf beside his desk. In the small human annex the Empire had once considered too insignificant to bother naming properly, and did not open it that day or the day after. The galaxy, for the first time in 8,000 years, had nothing left to say.